Hi there, and welcome to today's webinar, The Perfect Webinar, How Niche Publishers Can Make Serious Money, Build Audience, Inform, and Entertain, or otherwise known as Why Webinars Don't Have to Suck. Sponsored by and hosted by Niche Digital and WebAttract, the leaders in informational webinars. I'm Lori Dearman, Senior Webinar Producer with WebAttract, and I'll be your moderator and one of your hosts for today's session. In just a moment, I'll be introducing our featured speakers, Carl Landau and Mike Agron, who will be sharing what they hope you'll get out of today. But first, let me tell you a bit about who's in the audience. We've invited you, along with over 350 professionals registered from 5 different countries, representing 37 states and provinces, spanning a variety of industry media types. Regardless of your industry media type or your location, we're confident you'll find today's webinar of value, as we've carefully selected examples that apply to each of these media types. I would like to see, using a show of hands, and when I say a show of hands, I mean using your GoToWebinar hand, if you're currently offering webinars as part of your integrated marketing strategy. Let's see how that's looking. Looks like we're topping out right there at about 25%. Very interesting, and certainly do appreciate you weighing in on that, because if you're already offering webinars or you're still evaluating their value, there certainly will be plenty to think about over the next 45 minutes. So really appreciate your weighing in. And now I would like to go ahead and introduce our host and sponsor for today, Carl Landau.
Anyway, thanks a lot, Lori and Mike and the whole WebAttract team. First thing everyone knows, the official title is Carl Landau Grand Poobah Niche Media. You guys are in really good hands. WebAttract team is incredible. Their efforts are totally gold-plated. They do everything from the promotion to the programming is totally first class. Anyway, I really want to thank all the niche heads out there. You know, I've been working with niche media companies for 15 years, and I really appreciate your support and everyone listening in. And this is the very, very first time I've ever done a webinar, so I'm excited. Although I'm probably the perfect guy to be the guest host, because I'm not a webinar guy. I probably listened to my very first webinar 8 years ago, and it was terrible. It was a total sales pitch, and then within 5 minutes of the webinar, got a sales call. Lori, are there going to be sales calls immediately after this webinar?
I'm thinking no.
Okay. Anyway, Mike has totally turned me around regarding webinars. He's proved to me that it's really great revenue source, a great lead gen vehicle. And what I really like is it really provides quality content for your audience. And that's something we've been really working hard at Niche Media, really just over the past year, to really provide quality content. Besides on our live events, we have a daily blog going out, and that has been really successful. And I'm looking forward to learning myself a lot from Mike during the webinar. And particularly, I'm looking forward to the last 15 minutes, which is Q&A from you guys, and really interested in know what you want to know about webinars and share information. As far as Mike, he's teaching a great session at our Nashville Niche Digital Conference. Anyway, once again, a big thank you to Lori and Mike and the entire WebAttract team. And I just want to say to everyone, really just enjoy the webinar. I'm really looking forward to it. And thanks for joining us.
All right. Well, Carl, right back at you. Thank you. And I know you have been very skeptical about webinars as a medium in general, so I personally am delighted to be part of your maiden voyage. And for now, however, it is time to bring on one of our other hosts for today, Mike Agron, who has an action-packed agenda for us. And just a few words in the way of an introduction for Mike. He's a webinar demand generation expert and award-winning author of Webinar Ready, a step-by-step guide to hosting successful webinars. Note that a free copy of the ebook, which is essentially our playbook for doing webinars, will be made available to each of you on the webinar today. And Mike is also the co-founder and executive webinar producer for WebAttract. He's moderated and produced literally hundreds of webinars for global and emerging brands, where his approach is to uncover something unique that will make money for his sponsors while delighting his audiences. So Mike, welcome to the webinar, Sacramento.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you, Carl. And thank you, folks in the audience, for joining us. We are, as Carl said, very excited to have all of you. And to get started, when you registered, we asked all of you a question. What would you like to learn today? We do that for a couple of reasons, mainly because unlike a live in-person event, we'll never get to meet most of you, and the best way we could meet you is virtually. And so when we ask you what you want to learn, this is the way the results came back. So 51% of you are interested in best practices, 38% on how do you monetize webinars, 7% had some other ideas, and 4% on how to market webinars. So what we've done is we've put together some key topics that are going to address these as best we can. And what we want to make sure of is that whether you're a seasoned pro at doing webinars, or maybe you're looking for a fresh take, or you want to get started, what we want you to do and what I want you to do is to walk away with some new ideas so you can make your webinars even more engaging and more profitable. I'm going to try and answer as many of the questions as possible. And if I don't answer the questions, and as Lori said, please keep them coming in, I would absolutely invite everybody to feel free to contact me for a complimentary one-on-one, because your situation is probably going to be different than other people on here. I'd be more than happy to spend some time with you on exploring what your webinar goals and objectives are. But let's get started and look at, first off, why are webinars a key marketing tactic? And then how do you develop successful webinars? And then I'm going to go into some niche publisher case studies. We do work for a lot of publishers. We've got a few up here that are pretty interesting to show you the breadth and depth of the type of webinars and that all these people are making money with them. And then how do you look at pricing? What are some pricing models and supercharge your webinar so you provide your sponsors with a very, very high return on investment? And then we're going to go into some best practices. We'll talk about some of the top webinar blunders to avoid. And then I'll give a little marketing 101 and some ideas to get started. Lori's going to be joining me. So I think the first thing is that we all know the world is not the way it used to be. Back in the old days of 5 years ago, I should say, the way we often reached our B2B buyers or any of our buyers was to knock on their doors. I know when I started in the computer business, that was the uniform of the day, was a three-piece suit and knocking on doors. But today, the online world has changed everything. A recent study validates that 70% of buyers, particularly B2B buyers, do want to do their research online before they even talk to a live salesperson. So think about it. Webinars are a great forum to provide that vehicle. But what's also changed is the way marketing is done. There used to be the notion of traditional marketing, and today it's been replaced by a term called content marketing. And there's actually an institute, if you're not familiar with, called the Content Marketing Institute. They've got some fantastic resources and some information. And really what content marketing is about is how do you educate and make buyers more intelligent with the objective of driving a more profitable customer action. So what that means is, if you look at the left side of my screen, informational webinars are about business value, lessons learned, best practices, metrics, case studies, as opposed to a sales pitch where you're talking about a specific product or features and benefits and pricing. That's not what your audience wants to hear today. Laura, I think you wanted to jump in here. We were talking about these slides before.
I did, absolutely, because I know you'll agree with me when I say that this slide really, it's a critical point in the success of a webinar. And I did just want to add my 2 cents because I find when you're so close to the message that you're delivering, it can be challenging to discern whether your content is actually informational or coming off as a sales pitch. So I wanted to share a few questions that I ask speakers that I work with as a sanity check, if you will. So some of the things that I ask are, what will attendees walk away with? So think about your content and what will they walk away with? Are there any aha moments? Can you identify any aha moments? And if not, you need to think about that. And another question I ask is, would someone pay to attend? So even if your webinar is free, time is money. And if attendee feels like your content is basically a thinly veiled sales pitch, they may feel deceived and will be less likely to want to continue the conversation, which is really the actual goal of your webinar. So just some things to kind of keep it real and help you identify informational versus sales pitch.
Thanks, Lori. And actually, the Content Marketing Institute does an annual study. They do it for B2B and B2C. but this most recent one was done with the Content Marketing Institute and Marketing Profs, and they did a research study on what are some of the trends and budgets of marketeers. And we were naturally pleased when the top tactics that were revealed started with in-person events where the marketeers felt they were 67% effective, and then case studies, and then webinars and webcasts came in as the third. They're also a lot less expensive to do than a live in-person event. But our goal, again, is to show you how these can be effective in doing events. And we can send a link to this study. It's free. It's a great study that will show
Mike,
you.
Could I just add one thing here?
Yeah.
Because it hand in hand, it says live events are, way up there. And I'm finding from more and more publishers that, do live events that webinars actually are a fantastic way to promote live events. So those two really can go hand in hand quite well.
Absolutely. Thanks, Carl. So the first thing to look at, and part of why I have such a passion for working with media publishers, is that you folks are just natural sources for great content and access to thought leaders. And what audiences really love to hear today from industry analysts, they want to hear about trends and challenges and opportunities. Where is the industry going? They want to hear from authors. They want to have white papers presented or research reports or client case studies. And nothing like a webinar breathes life into all of these things. So you have a natural built-in source of content that is very much of interest and in demand. But anybody can do a mediocre webinar, or to use Carl's words, anybody can do a webinar that sucks. Well, what separates them, and what are the challenges to doing a good webinar? Well, I'm talking about webinar demand generation, and that specifically is about lead gen. That's about attracting an audience for being able to see if there's an opportunity for them to become a customer. But you know what? What you're going to be hearing applies to any type of webinar you do, whether it's B2C, whether it's training, whatever. There's still best practices. But the three challenges are, how do you target and attract the right audience? And then once you get them to register, how do you get them to attend and keep them engaged so they're inspired that at the end of the webinar they'll want to have a conversation with you where you can see, does it make sense to move them up the sales funnel to go from a prospect to a customer? And I call the webinars that do that supercharged. And what I mean by that is, and Lori kind of mentioned that in my introduction, a webinar needs to provide two things. It needs to provide the sponsor with an ability to meet or exceed their commercial outcomes. It also has to add value to your audience. So you're walking both of these lines. You need to both provide business value, and you need to also make sure your audience is getting value. And when I talk about outcomes, let me just share with you the type of outcomes and metrics that I'm talking about. And as the ad says, your mileage will vary. But if you look at registration, I'm talking about a supercharged webinar that's going to provide 250 to 1,000 people to register. And that would yield an attendance of 100 to 400. And that these are webinars where 80% of your peak audience will still be on at the start of the Q&A. And then if you do a survey, you'll find that you have a satisfaction of 85% with the audience that met, was above, or exceeded. And the other thing about webinars that I always call the content gift that keeps on giving is you have the ability to repurpose and leverage the shelf life through on-demand viewings. And this can often be in the form of fresh new sales leads for people who neither registered or attended the webinar. So these are the kind of outcomes that I'm talking about. But Lori, I'd like to now learn from the audience a little bit more about what are their drivers for offering a sponsored webinar. So Lori, could you go ahead and launch this poll, and we'll take a quick poll and then we'll move on.
Absolutely. And folks, in this case, we're asking to use your honor system here and select your top two. Got the results there on the screen. 66% of you saying extend online revenue opportunities, 43% leveraging brand awareness, 47% creating new demand gen opportunities for advertisers, 24% extending the value of existing content, and 26% saying thought leadership to create competitive differentiation. Mike, any thoughts on these responses?
I think they're right in line with what folks said they wanted to learn, and I think they're perfect. I mean, I think all of these are benefits of doing webinars, so I'm pleased with it and ready to go to the next section. Let's start with a couple things to keep in mind. And again, I am not a person that believes in theory. Theory is great, academia is fine, but I want to talk about things that work, that are real. So what I'm sharing with you are things that are real, that work. And this slide here that's coming up is probably one of the most important things to factor in doing a webinar. They are magnets for attracting people who are ripe to become your customers. But here is where the rubber hits the road. The only people that are really going to sign up for a webinar are people like the gentleman on the left who is experiencing a level of disruption in their industry, in their business. They've got a pain point. They know they could have better outcomes. They could get to market faster. They could get more people to come to an event, but they're not satisfied. Or, like the lady on the right, they're actively looking for a solution. And what that means is, your topic has to be a must-have. People do not have time today for a nice-to-have. They're just not going to even consider it. So it must be a must-have. But really, to drill down, and I'm going to give you an example, a really well-produced and delivered webinar, again, that's supercharged, understands that there are disrupted markets out there, understands that if there's a market in disruption and you can show a solution that helps that market get better outcomes, and you can have speakers who are passionate and knowledgeable, you will have a lot of interest from your webinar. And I'm going to give you an example. This is one we just did a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of the most interesting ones. This is a case study on how a car dealership group was able to use service leads when you bring your car in for service to increase new car sales. Now think about it. What industry, such as retail, has been more disrupted? The car business is never going to be the same. Putting those balloon yellow people on your roof to get people to come in, that's just not going to work. It's a whole different world. You've got to be smart. And so the sponsor of this webinar is a company called Mobile Productivity Incorporated, and they have a solution that helps car dealers be able to increase revenues 3 to 4% on repair orders. And so the way the webinar was put together, because that's a very, very timely topic, in the center of the screen, we had a well-known industry expert, sales expert, talk to us about how the industry is changing. And then the gentleman, Terry, actually gave a case study on how he was able to determine that this would be the right solution. What were his challenges, his options, what were the results, what were the lessons learned, and the best practices. It was riveting. But this is an example of how a disrupted market has a disrupted solution will draw people. But the thing I like most about webinars is that it's a time for storytelling. I mentioned a few moments ago that it gives you an opportunity to breathe life into a topic. But I always think about when I was a kid and when I had my kids and we went camping, we'd sit around the campfire and we would tell stories. And it was just so much fun to share stories. And that's what a good webinar does. It tells stories. In fact, I think a webinar is really a radio show with pictures. And like a good radio show, it's kept fast-paced. You eliminate awkward silence and dead air, but it's a way to connect and communicate with your audience. But it's also a mini theatrical event. Every time we do a webinar, it's a brand new show, no matter who the client is. And we usually find that it's broken up into 5 acts. All of these acts are covered in the book. I'm not going to go through each one of them in detail, but it starts with setting the stage for a smooth production. How do you identify and recruit an audience? How do you develop content? How do you practice that content? What do you do as far as sound checks to go live? And what do you do after the webinar? And our experience is you should budget 6 to 8 weeks from the time you decide you're ready to go and to the time you go live.
You know, Mike, I was just going to say, I was amazed at the amount of effort that goes behind the scene in putting together the webinar. That until you do it, you have absolutely no idea what's involved.
Well, thank you. And I think it's really based upon How do you start? You need to have a methodology. This needs to be deadline driven. You need to have a series of best practices. Plus, you need a series of metrics to measure along the life cycle, not only to make sure you're going to have a successful outcome, but if you're not getting the right tracking metrics, what can you do to fix it? We'll talk a little bit about that. But it's also an ongoing balancing act. I got some questions from some of the folks who registered for the webinar. What's a good webinar platform? Well, there's a lot of great platforms out there, but if you look at this graphic, it's really balancing your business drivers, your logistics, your human factors, and the technology. All of these things weigh into a successful webinar. Now let's move into some niche publisher case studies. And I'm going to first talk about what are some of the popular webinar themes. There's basically 3 themes that people are interested in. And some of these may be a little bit more B2B, but they're still of interest to an audience. The first one is the case study that talks about business improvement. The MPI example I just gave was a case study. The other one that's big is a how-to, a tutorial. That's sort of what we're doing today. It's kind of a tutorial. And the third is standards and compliance. Again, if you're in a disrupted industry and standards and compliance issues are constantly changing, you can do your readers a tremendous job by keeping them in the know with what's going on here and what they need to do about it. But let's take a look at our first one here. And this is for a niche pub called Directions Media. And they're really focused on...
Hey, Mike, while we're strolling down memory lane, wasn't this the first client that you essentially based WebAttract's model off of?
Yes, actually it was, and they have a thriving business of doing webinars. I approached Joe Francisco, who's the editor-in-chief, and I said, Joe, I got some ideas on how you can increase your revenues going beyond spinning banner ads. And anyway, one thing led to another, and we launched this, and it became very, very successful. But if you take a look at this one, this was sponsored by IBM. This was done a couple of years ago. The title is Police Departments Reduce Crime with Spatial Analytics. What was so interesting about this is that the audience, who were mostly law enforcement and government, were treated to an understanding of how you can use spatial analytics, location analytics, to not only understand your crime patterns, but to predict where crime is going to be. And so IBM sponsored this because they had experts on here that wanted to talk about this as a solution. Very interesting webinar. The next one was also a very interesting webinar, and I think, Laura, you remember this. We did this not too long ago. This is for a client. They're called Novel. That's a little K up in the corner. They're a New York-based web analytics firm. They're an emerging firm. We've actually done 15 webinars with them, and I mention that because they're all thought leadership. They never really mention their products on the webinar, but what they try to do is bring together an audience that would be interested in learning something new. What they sell are online solutions. Now, I have to tell you, this one here was a perfect example of a webinar that we launched that started to flatline. And the reason was we wanted to go beyond aerospace use of composites. Everybody, I think, is aware that composites are terrific for aerospace, but what about legacy industries such as bridges? They're not thinking of composites. And so when we put this together, we originally had the 2 gentlemen in the center and on the right, fabulous speakers, but guess what? When people came to the landing page, they saw 2 potential vendors, and it turned them off. They thought it was a sales pitch. The results of registration were very, very bleak, to say the least. We were fortunate through one of them to get Jeff Sloan, who's the editor of Composites World, be the media sponsor. What happened was, after 10 days, we had 35 people enrolled for this. After we got Jeff, we had over 600 people. Made all the difference in the world by having the credibility and the association.
On that one, I wouldn't have believed it if I didn't see it for myself. So I think that's a point worth emphasizing, that if you're not getting the registrations you're looking for, take a look at that. Are you using a third party? And if not, give it a try.
Yeah, it was basically, Houston, we have a problem. But that turned out to be a happy story. This is one of a favorite one of mine, and this is for an association, for the Arthritis Foundation. And I participated a couple years ago in what was called the Ride of a Lifetime. It was an opportunity to do fundraising and ride your bike from San Francisco to LA. And I naturally suggested, why don't we do a webinar to help fundraise, but also teach riders what they need to know about such a ride? Because let's face it, how many people ride 500 miles in 8 days? So we had Amy from the Arthritis Foundation, we had a former rider, Harry Friedman, but we also had Jeff Bass to talk about how to do the fundraising, but we had Dave Britton, who was an Olympic coach, bike riding coach, to come on and give folks a tip. It was a great way, Carl, as you said, to promote a live event and also to bring awareness and to educate members. Very, very well received.
Who's that guy in the top left-hand corner there?
That would be me.
Oh, okay.
Do you like that picture better?
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. And it was the ride of a lifetime. This is one of my favorites and most recent webinars that we did. This is by another niche publisher. It's called Inside GNSS, which stands for Geospatial Navigation Satellite System Community. And the webinar was done on unmanned aerial systems, better known as drones. And what their objective was to get their audience together and show them use cases for drones beyond military and law enforcement. There were over 700 people that registered for this from over 60 countries. There's so many more of these that I'd love to share with you, but they're all about the same opportunity to reach that targeted audience and give them something of value that they didn't have before. So I want to move quickly into a little bit on pricing models. This does vary, but let me take a look at some of the ways webinars are sold today. One of the most popular ways is the CPL, or cost per lead. And that is to put together a value proposition where you're charging your sponsor a cost per lead. Another is a fixed service fee. As I mentioned, you can become a media sponsor and get fees for that, or fees for speaking. Personally, we believe in the fixed service fee. It's as a professional services organization, but there's all different ways of doing this. But what really determines what you can charge and how you can market is what type of ROI are you giving back to your sponsors. Now, this is really probably one of the most amazing things about those publishers that are able to monetize on webinars. Up front, when a webinar is put together, you want to make sure that your sponsors are getting in touch with decision makers. And so during the registration, question is asked, do you recommend, specify, or influence the purchase of products or services? And as you can see here, 48% yes to both. No, 23% said no, 22% yes on products, so on and so forth. The point is, you've got a highly qualified audience that can make a purchasing decision. Now, I believe that if you give, it's okay to ask for something. So at the end of the webinar, when the information is given and people learn a lot, the most important thing to see is how did we impact the needle or their intent to purchase. So if you take a look at this one here, we asked, having attended today's webinar, what are your plans to purchase or acquire products or services? 47% increased. 24% said they were just researching, but now they intend to acquire. 24% said they were researching and no need, and 5%. So you're able to go back to your sponsor and show them this, that the intent to acquire was higher, and you can actually use this to begin to segment those leads that you want to follow up on. Another interesting metric is it said response 26%. This is a voluntary survey, okay? Nobody has to fill this out, but 26% of that audience filled it out. So I thought that was pretty impressive, and this is really the tail of the tape, the rubber hits the road, whatever you want to call. This is where creating your value proposition allows you to get premium pricing for your webinars. Lori, let's now move into the best practices. We're right on schedule, and I know we've got a lot of questions coming in here. So this section is called loosely Best Practices. And as Carl says, so your webinars don't suck. Here's 10 webinar blunders to avoid at all costs. The first one is planning. If you fail to plan, I guarantee you plan to fail. What Carl was saying earlier in watching us put this together is there is so much behind the scenes work that goes in to putting a webinar together, from understanding your objectives. Why are you doing the webinar? What is the value the audience will get? What are your success factors? How do you know at the end of the webinar you're going to be successful? What's your call to action? What's the call to action for the audience? What are you going to do? And are you making sure you're analyzing the life cycle intelligence that you've gathered? So many people fail to do this, and this is probably a root cause of why webinars suck. The other one is not making your audience the top priority. We're thrilled to have everybody here. We know you vote by your time. You could be someplace else. It's our goal to give you as much value as we can and understand what's important to you. The other area that I mentioned, and this slide could be a webinar for a day, is using metrics. And metrics help you identify before the event, during the event, and after the event how well you're doing. And you gather life cycle intelligence. It helps you better learn who is in your audience and what's important to them, and how can you give them the information. Another big area is poor email marketing practices. We always recommend starting 2.5 to 3 weeks before you go live. And you do that because you're going to do several drips, several touches, but it gives you an opportunity in the first couple of days to measure what kind of open rates did you have, what kind of click-through rates did you have, are you tracking? Absolutely critical. And part of that, yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Well, I was going to say one thing on the email that I see as far as webinars that drives me crazy. People just also over email, and you're constantly hit with it. The really bad thing about that is it's going back to that list and promoting other things. So that's one thing I would definitely recommend, is not over promoting too.
Yes, and there's a way to do that, which is to not, if you send it to somebody and they opened it and they didn't respond, leave them alone. Go to other people who haven't opened it. And part of doing that is making sure you change up your email subject line, because think about it, if it's in your inbox and you don't open it, there's no way anybody's going to get a chance to read it or register. And doing subject swaps for each drip, it's very important, different subject line for each one. And doing A/B testing, we always recommend doing A/B testing, see which one works. This one here is one of my favorites. It's Death by PowerPoint. There's actually a book called Death by PowerPoint. It's kind of humorous. But the purpose of the webinar is not to overwhelm your audience with a lot of text on slides. It's to be able to share with them and connect with them. And part of how you do that is to make sure that you can find your speaker's passion to be authentic. It's more important that your speakers come across with something of value, and that you have more of a dialogue than a monologue. That's part of Lori's role in the moderator, part of having Carl on here. It's more than just talking heads. And part of this is practicing your flows and your cues and your transitions during your what we call table reads and dress rehearsals.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, again, you get so close to your content that it's tough to let some of it hit the cutting room floor. But honestly, folks can only remember so much on a webinar, and the analogy that I often use is you don't want them to feel like they're drinking through a fire hose. You want to deliver your content and you want to bring it to life for them. So really think about that. And if they want to know more, they'll contact you after.
Absolutely. And speaking of drinking from a fire hose,
yeah.
I'm going to show you a real slide here. This is a before slide.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it should be up right now. This was actually given to us by a wonderful partner of ours. And I said, are you kidding me? What do you want me to do with this? Where are my eyes supposed to go? And he says, well, we use this for training. I said, you know what? That may be perfect for training, but can we work on distilling this down to being a little bit more easy on the eyes? So if you look at this, it says sample of BANT and sales ready leads. And then there's a little verbiage at the bottom. So here's what we came up with. Let's just make the high level points here. Let's make it graphically pleasing. You've got everything on this slide you need to talk to. You don't have to make people eyes dart all over the place. So this is just one of the things that's important in slides. More white space, more visuals, less text. Now, one of the biggest blunders is ignoring the sound check. What I can tell everybody on this call is that audio is absolutely the Achilles heel of all webinars. And you may not think that using a PC or a Mac without a headset isn't going to cause a problem, or you may think using a speakerphone is going to be okay, or a wireless phone. I'm here to tell you that it's not only damaging, but it creates a barrier between you and your audience. I'm going to show you that. So there's 3 different ways to really connect with your audience. One is with a landline. That's free, okay? And I'll show you the difference. The other is to use a consumer headset or microphone, the one you see on the right. That's what Carl's on. Or a professional microphone. The difference between these is the quality of the electronics and the size of the apertures that move, the diaphragms that move the air to create more sound. Let me give you a little taste right now. Right now you're hearing me on my professional microphone. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself. I'm now speaking to you on a speakerphone. And Lori and Carl, can you hear a difference from me on the speakerphone?
Yeah,
absolutely.
All right. I'm going to pick it up and talk through the handset. All right, now I'm talking through the handset. Hopefully that you and everybody in the audience can hear the difference between using a professional microphone and a handset like this. So let me go back to my mic. All right, I'm back on the microphone. I hope
You're
so.
back.
Yeah, it sounded like you were an astronaut there. So, yeah.
Well, that's my moonlighting job.
Okay.
The thing to remember is this: that if you have a option on your webinar platform to have voice over IP, and you have the right internet speeds, like at least 1.5 megabytes of upload and about 5 megabytes of download, please go for voice over IP. It's superior to a landline.
And Mike, I just wanted to kind of back up just a second to that best practice of sound check. Don't skip the sound check, because some things that I've learned over the years is whenever possible, when you're doing a sound check, so maybe a couple of days before the webinar, request that all of your speakers attend the sound check from the location that they'll do the go live, and using the same hardware setup and audio setup that they're going to use, because you really want to minimize the number of variables that you're going to have for go live day. That way you'll have fewer chances of what I call the Murphy's Law moment. And we've even gone as far as sending out USB headsets to our speakers so that we know exactly what it is that we're dealing with. So we know where the mute button is, and we know,
Right.
what they're looking at. Yeah. So these are just some things that streamline the go live and kind of get all the kinks out before the big day.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, go ahead,
The other
Carl.
thing I'd say is, since this was my first webinar, it really is helpful. We did a whole sound check deal about 2 days ago, and it just gets particularly someone who's new. You may have a new guest host or sponsor familiar with it, and when it actually is go day, with the webinar, it's really helpful to have that practice. And finally, Mike, do I need to return this headset, or is it mine?
It's yours, Carl.
Oh, okay, thank you.
But I want a cat in return.
Okay.
It's yours. Let's move on to our next blunder, which is something that's often overlooked, and that's failure to utilize a professional moderator. There's a couple reasons why. When Lori is not in front of the microphone, she's also coaching our speakers on how to present their information as engaging as possible, and every speaker has their own style. So a good moderator is also a trusted coach. It brings the best out in your speakers. But the moderator is also the orchestra leader. They're the rhythm section. They're leading the parade. They're making sure everybody's comfortable. They manage all the technology. But the other thing that they do is they have the courage to be direct. If we hear somebody is selling or not on message, we'll, as respectfully as possible, help them. And sometimes we'll even suggest a private session on the side just to get them comfortable. Moderators are a very important part of the webinar. Lori just talked about Blunder 8 a little bit, about skipping the final sound check. You cannot do enough testing. And testing should not be, and planning should not be confused with spontaneity. Nothing should ever replace your spontaneity. But technology has surprises. We always recommend the sound check an hour before you go live. Why? Because that's when problems happen. You don't want your speakers or your organizers to be stressed. Always turn off all non-essential apps, your printers, your cell phones, turn off Outlook, and have everybody who's not speaking quiet, mute them. A good best practice is to always print out a hard copy of your PowerPoint notes and slides. I think that's absolutely essential. The next blunder is not being prepared for the go live. Always start on time. Reward those people who got there on time. Don't wait for the stragglers. Welcome your audience. It's okay to be enthusiastic and excite, but it's not about selling. The time to sell is after the webinar. And make sure you deliver on your promises. We've had people sit down and we've gone through the invitation and said, well, these are the 3 things you're going to deliver on. And he says, oh, we have to talk about that. Yeah, that's what people want to hear. Make sure there's a call to action or next steps. And really the most important thing, it's all about connection. It's not about perfection. It's being real. It's not about anything else. And I would have to say that the 10th blunder is something that a lot of people overlook. They forget the housekeeping and the post-webinar analysis. When the webinar is done, edit and archive the webinar recording. Send thank you notes out with a copy of a link to the webinar. Do your final analytics report. Did you meet your outcomes? Start segmenting your leads and get back to the people that ask questions. So I'm going to wrap up and go to our final curtain call and just give you a couple of things to think about because I know we have a lot of questions. I've covered a lot of different instances of how to do a webinar. A lot of this is all in our book. That's free. I talked about some niche publisher case studies, some blunders. But here's what I'd like you all to do. Again, whether you're currently selling webinars or thinking about it, identify in your industry, as only you know, or your association, what are the key disruptive changes going on? And then which of your advertisers or prospects or members would have a great story or a tutorial to share around the process or improvements? That'll help you create a value prop and pricing model to attract sponsors. And by all means, there's lots of checklists in our Webinar Ready book that you can use to start the planning process. Those are just a couple of things to think about. Well, Lori, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know we've got some questions coming in, so thank you all for your attention, and I'm ready to answer some questions.
And that we do. So I'm going to ask both you, Mike, and Carl to step up to the virtual podium. And funny thing is, we had two of our attendees, Joseph and Lisa, ask along the same lines of a question. PowerPoint and audio versus a video event. When is it best to use each? So Joseph's asking, Joseph and Lisa.
Joseph and Lisa, the metaphor of a demand generation webinar being a radio show with pictures is intentional from several reasons. One, it's very cost effective. Two, even though it's virtual and you've got people in remote places, it's easier to control unknowns. And the biggest unknown that I mentioned was the audio. And believe it or not, the audio changes for everybody on this call. If they have a fast internet connection or a slow internet connection, it can be difficult for them to hear us at times, or the slides can be jerky. When you add video, which I love, you have to be very specific about the use case because video requires more bandwidth, and it also requires that the person, if the video is on the person, that they are friendly to the camera, because if they're not, their body language, if they scowl or if they're not smiling, is going to come across. I would almost say you have to really be absolutely certain of what you're going to be using video for. And in the hundreds and hundreds of webinars we've done for an hour webinar or less, what we're doing here works just fine.
All right, let's go to our next question. What are some of the other webinar metrics that are useful?
There are 6 webinar metrics that are key. The first is what we call this click-through ratio, or CTR, and that measures the conversion of how many people came to your landing page and actually registered. The second is the attendance ratio. Of those people that registered, how many attended? We'd like to see 40%. Another metric is how do people vote in the polls from an engagement standpoint. We want to see 70% of the audience voting. We know that they're engaged. Another metric is retention. I mentioned this earlier. We'd like to see 80% of the audience still on at the start of the Q&A. And another metric, if I didn't miss out on any of them, is how people vote on surveys, but probably the after the webinar, the on-demand viewings. How many people actually viewed the on-demand viewing? So those are the 6 key metrics, Lori.
Okay, perfect. Let's see here. I've got a great question from Jim, and Jim is asking, we present webinars as lead generation opportunities for advertisers. They're usually successful, but the amount of prep time it takes to put on a webinar seems to be a huge barrier to entry. Any suggestions on how to overcome this objection?
Short of me taking a cheap shot and saying hire us, I think that in all seriousness,
that was going to be the answer.
well, that was I had to do that, Carl. Sorry. If you can send cats in the mail, I can answer that. Really, what you want to do is be prepared for what it takes to do a webinar. There are those 5 acts that you need to go through. One of the things that we have found, and webinars are time consuming, there's no question about it, is to have a plan. In our book, there are checklists and things you can do. Some of those things can help you streamline the process, but there really is no shortcut to taking the time to do it right. You know, I mentioned about 6 to 8 weeks. Have we done them in less time? Yeah. But only with clients that we know that we've worked together with. But in the example I gave from Composites World, where we were flatlining on registration, had we not budgeted 8 weeks for that webinar and had 3 weeks to drive registration, there's no way we could have recovered. I think it's really finding somebody in your organization that wants to be the champion, that's passionate about webinars, to drive it home and to manage it. That would be my best advice.
Boy, you guys are coming in with fabulous questions, almost faster than I can read them. So here we have a good one from, hold on, Sean. And Sean's asking, for B2B audience, what is the recommended timing of emails promoting the webinar to gain registration versus list destruction?
Sean, the way we look at it is this. First off, only you know your audience as best as anybody. And if you're going to give your audience something of value, then there's less of a risk of fatiguing your list. But if you're constantly sending things out to them that are of little of value, they will tend to ignore it. 3 weeks is our recommended time frame from the time you are going to go live. And what's important is that the demographic or the people you're sending to match the value proposition. And one of the ways we measure this to know we're not fatiguing our list is by measuring the unsubscribes. For email marketing campaigns, if our unsubscribe rate is 2%, we're doing okay. To me, anything above 1% is too much. I like to see probably about 0.5, 0.6, 0.7% of people unsubscribe. And that tells me they may not be interested in the subject, but they're not finding it intrusive or annoying that they're going to unsubscribe from my list. So I really think it comes down to knowing what the value proposition is, what are they going to get out of it, and you know, we send to both opt-in and non-opt-in list, and we've had no problem managing our campaigns, doing 3 or 4 drips over that period. Hopefully I answered the question, Lori.
But by the way, just in our efforts here, we just sent out 2 emails specifically about the webinars. We had very few people that unsubscribed. I mean, it was very, I think it was a total of 25, and our list is pretty big, 13,000 names. So that worked out fine. The rest we did via social media and probably got half the people through social media efforts.
Okay, perfect. And I think we really have time for just one more question. So, Mike, this one coming from Jordan. We produce several trade shows and conferences each year and would like to utilize webinars to promote our events and tease at content that will be delivered at the events. Is this recommended, and what would be the best practice for doing this?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific use case for a webinar, particularly if you're able to provide value, teases to the audience of what they're going to learn. I mean, actually, that's really what a webinar is. It's kind of a preview, like when you sit through the movies and you see all the trailers. It's just to get you interested enough to want to come back and buy a ticket. So I would absolutely encourage you to do that. And again, I mean, I don't have enough time to give you the full strategy on it, but happy to talk to you about it through email or give me a call. But I think it's a wonderful way to use a webinar. I think it's fantastic.
All right. And any final comments from you, Mike? Then I'll go over to you, Carl, and we'll close out. So, Mike?
Very quickly, I just want to thank everybody for their interest and their time today. I hope I get to meet a lot of you in Nashville. Particularly want to thank you, Carl and Robin, for sponsoring this. It's gone beyond my wildest expectations as far as having this quality of an audience. So I just wanted to say that, but I'll let Carl close.
Yes, because Carl, I really want to hear, in addition to your final comments, how did we do today, and do you still think webinars have to suck, and can they entertain and add value?
Well, Mike had turned me over as far as the opinion way before the webinar, but it was really great. And, I was just really interested in the metrics and how it all works. And it's been a wonderful experience working with you guys. Anyway, and once again, looking forward to seeing everyone in Nashville. And anyway, have a good day, everyone.
Fabulous. And folks, we are at that time. I do want to take a moment to thank each of you for joining us, and hope that you found today's webinar of value and you'll want to join us for some future events. And special thanks to Carl Landau of Niche Media and Robin Ireland for making today possible. And again, as your moderator, this is Lori Dearman saying thank you and have a great rest of the week. Bye for now.